you join me inside the Kia EV6, a brand new electric car that Kia reckons can charge faster than a Tesla, go further than a Hyundai Ioniq 5, and even out-accelerate a Porsche Taycan 4S. Sounds pretty special, doesn't it? This is our first chance to drive it, and in this video, I'm going to be finding out if it's as good as it sounds. Now, the EV6 is the third electric model in Kia's lineup after the e-Niro, which won our Car of the Year award back in 2019, and the slightly boxier but similar sized Soul EV. But both of those cars are available with petrol engines as well, whereas this has been designed from day one to be a bespoke electric car. It actually has a lot in common with the Hyundai Ioniq 5. Kia, of course, is owned by Hyundai, but there are a lot of differences as well, and not only in the looks department. Now, we've already done a full walk around on this car already. You can actually watch that by clicking the link up there at the top somewhere. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the looks and the inspiration and all that malarkey, but I do want to know what you think. Do you prefer this to the Hyundai Ioniq 5, or do you in fact prefer the Tesla Model 3 to both of those Korean cars? Let us know in the comments below. What might surprise you though is the size of this car. It's actually quite big. It's slightly longer than a Jaguar I-Pace, and actually the wheelbase, that's the gap between the front axle and the rear axle, is nearly as big as it is in a Tesla Model S. So this is a big car, and that should give it a lot of advantages when it comes to practicality, something we'll be covering a little bit more later on. It also makes the starting price of just over £40,000 seem quite reasonable, although the EV6 doesn't qualify for a £2,500 grant from the government, something that you can get on some versions of the small e-Niro and Soul EV. It's also around £4,000 more than the starting price of the Ioniq 5, a car that, as I've already said, shares a lot in common with this, but it isn't quite as simple as that, and here's why. All UK versions of the EV6 have a 77.4 kilowatt-hour battery. In the Ioniq 5, you can choose between either a 58.2 kilowatt-hour battery, or there's also a 72.6 kilowatt-hour option. And yes, that does give the Kia a longer range between charges. If you go for the rear-wheel drive model, that can do up to 328 miles on a charge, whereas this more powerful dual-motor version, that can do 314 miles. The EV6 can also charge at slightly faster rates than the Ioniq 5, at up to 250 kilowatts. In the Ioniq 5, if you go for the bigger battery versions, they can accept up to 232 kilowatts, but the smaller battery models only 175. 250 kilowatts is also genuinely faster than you can charge any Tesla Model 3. The only problem is there are only around 15 locations across the country that have these super fast Ionity chargers that can deliver that much power, whereas Tesla has more than 600 superchargers spread across more than 70 locations throughout the UK. As with all Kias, you get a 7-year warranty as standard on the EV6 and on the whole car, not just on the battery. In the Ioniq 5, you get 8 years of cover on the battery, but only 5 years on the rest of the car. The EV6 also has more powerful electric motors than its Hyundai cousin. The rear-wheel drive version has 226 bhp, and the dual-motor four-wheel drive version that we've got here has 321 bhp. But next year, a 577 brake horsepower GT model will also be offered, and that will be able to hit 60 miles an hour in just 3.5 seconds quicker than a Taycan 4S. Kia has intentionally set the EV6 up slightly differently from the Ioniq 5, with changes to the suspension, anti-roll bars and steering. But has that paid off in reality? Let's go for a drive and find out. Now, as I've already said, we're driving the dual motor version today, which is the most powerful EV6 you can buy until the GT model arrives next year, of course. And it's pretty quick actually, 0 to 60 takes around about 5 seconds. And I don't know if you can hear that, but there's this artificial space age sort of whirring noise you get when you accelerate hard. A lot of electric cars are employing similar technology these days, including the Taycan and the BMW iX3, and it just adds a dimension to the driving experience that you don't get in a lot of cheaper electric cars. Now, in setting the car up to be a little bit more agile, a little bit more fun to drive than the Ioniq 5 that it's based on, Kia acknowledges that there is a slight trade-off in ride comfort, but really it depends what you like. If you like quite a soft, floaty type waft that you get in a lot of SUVs these days, then the Ioniq 5 does that a little bit better. But in the EV6, you get a more controlled feeling. So on undulating roads like the one I'm driving along here, I'd argue it's actually better because you aren't bouncing up and down in your seat quite so much. You feel controlled, you feel connected with the road more. Now, I'm not going to get carried away. This isn't a Porsche Taycan or anything approaching that, but by wider electric car standards, it handles pretty well actually. Even on these quite twisty roads that we're on at the moment, there's plenty of grip, not too much lean, less than you would experience in an Ioniq 5, for example, and you can carry quite a lot of speed with some decent confidence. The steering, that could be slightly better. So Kia has actually opted for a slightly slower setup than the one you get in an Ioniq 5, and that just means that when you begin to turn the wheel, it doesn't react quite as immediately. But the margins aren't huge, and in both cases you could do with a little bit of a better sense of connection with the front wheels. It's just quite remote, and that's the only thing that really lets this car down in the handling stakes. So what about the interior? Well, there's not a lot to complain about at all when it comes to the driving position. Certainly the seats, they're nice and supportive, particularly around the sides when you're going around corners, and you get full electric adjustment if you go for GT line trim or above. And I also really like this armrest here. It's part of this sort of floating center console, and it's the same height as the one on the driver's door. So on long journeys, you can sit there quite comfortably and feeling very relaxed. So that's good. Another thing I like are these physical controls for the interior temperature. They're quite rare these days. A lot of manufacturers either put the controls in the touchscreen itself or have fiddly touch sensitive controls, but Kia has got physical dials for controlling the temperature, which is good. There are some touch sensitive controls for other parts of the air conditioning, though they do respond quite consistently to presses, which is good, but they're quite small and fiddly and distracting to use while you're driving, so that's not so great. The interior quality is also a bit of a mixed bag. Now, bear in mind that this car starts at just over £40,000. It's not cheap, so you would maybe hope for a few more soft touch plastics around. There is a vague soft touch feel to the tops of the doors there, and there's this funky texture on the face of the dashboard that's replicated on the centre armrest as well. You've also got some gloss black and silver finish around the place that helps lift things and make it feel not too cheap in here, but also the glove box lid, that feels a little bit low rent, as do the door bins down here, and there are some cheaper plastics in the back as well. So really not bad for the class, but when you start pushing this car towards £60,000, which it will cost if you go for the range-topping GT model that's launched next year, then perhaps not quite so great. The infotainment system is very similar to the one you get in most modern Hyundais and Kias. It's nice and big, usability is very good as well, and the response time's perfectly adequate. There's occasional lag when you press an icon before anything happens, but that's the case in most infotainment systems these days. The only thing worth mentioning is that in certain Hyundais recently, we have noticed quite a few software bugs that cause various crashes and other things. We haven't experienced that in the EV6 today. We've only had a few hours with the car days, so that is something worth bearing in mind and will require further testing to be sure of. Storage is pretty good though. You get a couple of cup holders here. There's a good sized bin under the armrest and a huge area down here below that you could put, well, a lunchbox or something. And the glove box is very deep and you'll fit plenty in that as well. And there is absolutely loads of space back here. Look at that. This seat in front is set up for my driving position. I'm just over 6 foot and I've got probably a good foot of knee room there. The only slight complaint is that foot space isn't brilliant under the front seats. I could do with a little more of that, although I do have that seat set as low as it will go. And actually headroom is good as well. Even if I sit as far back in the seat as I can, I've got a good couple of fingers left of space so my head isn't brushing the roof line, so that's very good. And actually, life is pretty good for the middle rear passenger as well, because for one, there is no big tunnel on the floor here to straddle, and secondly, headroom is pretty good as well. And that brings me on to two good, two bad things about the EV6. There is a frunk or front boot, but it isn't very big. It can just about take a laptop. The main boot isn't that big for a car of this size either. It's quite shallow, and although there is some underfloor storage, it isn't even enough to fit the charging cables in. While you're waiting for your EV6 to charge, one button reclines the front seats and you can have a snooze. And to a smaller degree, so do the ones in the back. There is quite a lot of road noise in the EV6, and Kia acknowledges that's partly because of the stiffer front and rear anti-roll bars that are fitted to the EV6 compared with the ones in the Ioniq 5. So it's something to bear in mind if you do a lot of miles on the motorway. This little gadget here plugs into the charging socket and converts your EV6 into a 3-pin domestic plug, which means you can even make a cup of tea. We've only spent a few hours with the EV6 so far, but that's more than enough time to tell you it's a very fine electric car. Is it better than the Ioniq 5 and Model 3? Well, that verdict will have to wait until later in the year when we've had a chance to drive all three cars back to back and also do our real-world range tests on the EV6, so look out for that video in the autumn. Until then, just head over to whatcar.com for lots more information. Thanks for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video then do give it a like and don't forget to subscribe for more reviews on the latest new cars.